Peak states and where to find them. I started learning about peak states with the ISPS, the Institute for the Study of Peak States, in 2013, and I've been fascinated by this subject ever since. I wanted to share some of the things I've learned from other areas and hopefully give you some ideas about how you can improve your chances of getting one or more of them. Let's start with defining what peak states and peak experiences are. One simple way to define a peak state is a fairly permanent state of better than normal functioning, often much better than normal. A peak experience is having this kind of state, but just for a short period of time, a more temporary state. A peak state means that people have a higher level of functioning, which is more pleasant than normal consciousness. However, although a peak state could be described as a more positive emotional state, for example, a continuous state of peace or joy or happiness, not all peak states are emotional. They can be physical, like feeling that the body is hollow or has golden light inside or feels sacred. They can be mental, like suddenly having perfect understanding of complex subjects beyond your normal ability. And they can be spiritual, like knowing God, communicating with God, or even becoming God. So why are peak states so important? Well, apart from giving us much more pleasant levels of consciousness, peace and happiness rather than anxiety and depression, psychologist Abraham Maslow found that even having temporary peak experiences makes people more likely to reach the higher levels of adult development. Research done in 2012 took this further and noted that people who had peak experiences were more likely to make ethical and empathetic decisions. Certainly, man has been searching for these higher states of consciousness for thousands of years, and there are a variety of techniques that have been around almost that entire length of time to facilitate them. Looking back, I realized that my education in peak states actually started in 2012 with a dog called Whiskey. He was my neighbour's dog, a bit Frankenstein to be honest, a bit of a collie, a bit of a Labrador, a bit of a Basset hound, and a bit of something else thrown in for good measure. But it wasn't his strange looks that appealed to me so much. It was his endlessly cheerful demeanour. In peak states parlance, we could say he had inner peace state, underlying happiness state, and being love. If a bigger dog snapped at him on our walks, he would snap back or cower, and his tail would go down and his smile would go too. But then as soon as we had passed the other dog, he'd be back to normal, all cheerful, trotting along, tail in the air, with a big smile on his face. And I paused to wonder how different it would be if a dog had attacked a human. The human would go home and tell everybody, "That dog did this to me. Oh my goodness, this is what happened. It was terrible." And they'd tell the story to everybody they knew. And then they'd go to the police station and run through the drama again. And then they'd file a complaint. It would end up in court. And 6 months later, they'd still be talking about that thing that happened with that dog on that day. Yet Whiskey had forgotten about his problems after 5 seconds. And I remember thinking, why can't humans be more dog? Back in 2012, I thought it was impossible, but now I've learned better. So let's look at some of the traditional ways that people have used to gain these elusive higher states of consciousness. Sadly, since coming to the West, yoga has lost a great deal of its power while increasing in its popularity. For the most part in the West, yoga is simply a relaxing physical exercise rather than a transformational practice. A Western yoga teacher will choose the postures that they feel like doing on the day, or follow a theme like stress or pregnancy. The students attend a class maybe once or twice a week. Learning traditional yoga from a guru at an ashram is very different. You are taught a specific sequence of practices, a combination of postures with breathwork and meditation. This practice must be done in the same order once or twice a day. The theory is that each part of the practice builds on the step before, climbing powerfully up to give maximum benefit. People who follow traditional yoga practices at the ashram I go to in India have described having these states: hollow state, inner peace, underlying happiness, gold inside, another life form state, and reduced sleep. In the same way that yoga has been corrupted on its journey to the West, martial arts coming from China, Japan, and Korea have experienced a similar decline in standards. Many dojos in the West are very financially driven. It's about producing as many black belts as possible. Traditional martial artists cynically call this McDojo, like McDonald's, fast martial arts. So the quality of teaching and the quality of expertise that the student gains is much reduced from what it would be in the East. While a traditional martial artist in Japan, for example, may take 15 to 20 years to gain good states of consciousness, in the West it would probably take 30 to 40 years or even longer to get to the same level. The kinds of peak states seen in the traditional martial arts teachers, men in their 80s and 90s, including void connection state, loving kindness state. One of the teachers says that when he is fighting, he becomes love. Other states that have been recognized include reduced sleep, being present, and a wide-angle vision state, which of course is very useful when you're dealing with attackers from both front and behind. Compared to yoga and martial arts, meditation is something that we're getting better at in the West, thanks to recent technological advances and better understanding of brain states. These days, using brain monitoring and neurofeedback, it's possible to achieve in a few months what a monk in a monastery might take 10 or 20 years to achieve. Guided meditations by people like Dr. Joe Dispenza and Dr. Dawson Church are readily accessible and make meditation much easier and much more beneficial for many people. The kinds of states that come from meditation include various forms of what different traditions call enlightenment, the inner peace state, and underlying happiness. I've been around horses for most of my life, so when I found out that there were new therapeutic methods which involved working with horses, I signed up straight away. There are several horse-facilitated methods to improve mental health, consciousness, and personal development. There are several horse-facilitated methods to improve mental health, consciousness, and personal development, including equine-facilitated learning, equine-facilitated psychotherapy, leadership training, and herd work. There are also programs working with people with addictions and for those with disabilities. I did some leadership training, both one-on-one and in a group, with a guy called Paul Hunting in southwest England. I wasn't actually interested in leadership, but I was very interested in working with the horses. Leadership training is usually undertaken by CEOs and people high up in major corporates having problems with subordinate staff or with leading teams. This can be very powerful work, but it can also be very challenging. I've seen grown men reduced to tears on these programs. It's incredibly frustrating for somebody who's used to getting everybody to do exactly what they're told, to not be able to make an animal do something very simple. In my intensive with Paul, we spent a couple of hours discussing my issues and setting goals for the session. Then, with me champing at the bit, we went down to the paddock to work with his two beautiful horses. What you have to understand is horses like to follow the leader. They don't like to lead. So if you can prove you have leadership skills, they will quite happily follow you. But leadership to a horse isn't about age, class, education or seniority. They don't respond to someone giving orders in a loud voice. It's much more subtle, more about demonstrating a certain embodied confidence. And it takes a while for us humans to get that. There you are in a paddock with two huge horses. You're a puny human weighing 160 to 200 pounds, and the horses are 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. You don't have a saddle or a bridle, no rope and no whip. And you have to persuade the horse to do what you want them to do. It's very challenging. However, once you get it, it's really very empowering. By the end of the day, when I had these two horses cantering around me in a circle, I felt wonderful, grounded, embodied, and exhilarated. Later, when I was driving home, I was quite euphoric and really feeling I could take on the world. It was a wonderful state to be in. The second time I worked with horses this way was hard work with a lady called Jo based in Wales, working with her herd of 27 horses. That was a very different experience. When you come to join the herd, it's about letting go of your individuality and following the herd mind. Being in your head and thinking isn't a safe position in the wild. If there's a predator in the woods, the horse runs first and asks questions later. Humans can be quite a liability with their endless curiosity. To be accepted by the herd, you need to get out of your head and into your body. So the strange thing that happened to me was while I was standing around with the horses not really coming anywhere near me, I suddenly had this overwhelming need to lie down on the ground, in among all the horse dirt and mud, and it was the strangest thing, because it seemed like the most normal thing to do, and it's something I would never have done in a normal state of consciousness. But when you assume that I was being invited into the herd consciousness, then it makes a lot more sense. So with horses, the peak states that I've heard about or experienced are being on track, being part of the herd mind, and the being love state. The curious thing is that it seems like humans have a herd capacity too. Hollywood has a fascination with action films, with Navy SEALs and special ops, so we probably think we know all about them. They are the strongest, toughest, and most dangerous combat soldiers in the world. They can run for miles with a heavy pack on their back in the pitch dark, without food or water for days, no weapons, and still overcome the enemy at the other end of the journey with their bare hands. But according to the book Stealing Fire, what the Marines are actually looking for when they train the SEALs and Special Ops is a particular peak state where the men can cast off their individuality, merge with the team, and follow whoever needs to be the leader in that moment, all without speaking or signaling. It's not a volitional thing, it's a subconscious thing. So that's why it costs so much to train them, because only about 20% of the Marines who make it as far as being trained in Special Ops can actually access this peak state. And those who can't access it are often broken by their failure to complete the training. It just goes to show that humans can access this herd state just as much as herds of horses or flocks of geese or shoals of fish. The other area where peak states comes up is the sexual arena. And when I talk to people about sensuality, spirituality, and the kinds of peak states that you can get from sexual activity, they all say to me, if you can get peak states from sex, how come everybody doesn't have them? So the peak states kind of sex I came across is the sexual equivalent of running a marathon. The key activity is penetration, and for most men it requires a certain level of adjustment. The normal 10 or 20 minutes of sexual activity simply isn't enough. Over a period of time, and using the exercises and practices in my book, Becoming the Sexual Athlete, it's possible to increase the man's penetration time by 50%, 100%, even 500%. And at the upper limits of time, miracles do happen. Stuart Savatsky, in his book Advanced Spiritual Intimacy, says that spiritual sexual states start to happen after the second hour of sexual embrace. The other things that are really important are trust, safety, and emotional connection. And in most cases, these states are going to come in connection with what Tantra calls the beloved, your husband, wife, or long-term love partner. Other researchers have noted that similarly expanded states can arise spontaneously in sex and can also be elicited in BDSM, bondage, dominance, submission, and masochism, which require a state of total surrender in the submissive partner. The states I've come across sexually include hollow state, gold and white inside state, goddess state. A friend of mine became Shiva after a marathon lovemaking session with his girlfriend, and he also told me about becoming love or loving kindness state was another thing that he had experienced. There's another interesting state that I've come across in 3 different ways. This is called left brain shutdown. There's a lot of research going on into left hemisphere dominance, and researchers are investigating what happened when the left brain is switched off and the right brain takes over. I didn't have a name for it until I found references to it in other books, but what I experienced felt very like a Zen state, very peaceful, with a very quiet mind. Unusually for me, I didn't think much, had no desire to read anything or listen to music, and I couldn't talk for 24 hours. The truth is, I could talk, but it was such an effort, such a struggle. It was much easier not to talk at all. In fact, I only started talking again because I had to go to work. The problem with these kind of altered states is that when you're in the state, you're not in a place where you can really assess or analyze or even remember what's going on, because those are mainly left brain functions. There's an excellent book by neuroscientist Jill Bolte-Taylor called My Stroke of Insight, where she talks about her experiences of having a stroke to the left side of her brain at the age of 37. The stroke returned her to a virtually infantile state. She lost the ability to speak, to talk, to walk, to feed herself, and it took 7 years for her to fully recover. Her TED talk is excellent if you haven't seen it. Jill describes how the left side of her brain was shut down and the right side opened her up to a whole expanded awareness where she felt at one with everything. She could sense the emotions of the people around her, sense things that were going on in the room out of her sight, and her awareness actually expanded outside her body. She said that when her left brain healed and finally came back online, she was actually very sad to lose that lovely state that she'd had. One of the authors of Return to the Brain of Eden, Tony Wright, frequently practices long periods of sleep deprivation, up to 11 days at a time. He says that one time, after about 80 hours of staying awake, the left hemisphere of his brain switched off, fell asleep, leaving the right side of the brain awake. Like me, he also entered a very religiously peaceful state with the inability to speak, but his state only lasted about 20 minutes before the left brain woke up and took charge again. Personally, I think gaining this state from sexual activity is a lot easier, more efficient, and certainly a lot more fun. So is there anything that we can do to facilitate accessing peak experiences and peak states? Yes, there is. Peak states of consciousness are now more accessible than ever and much quicker these days than using traditional practices. There are many things you can do to help speed things along. A daily traditional practice like Indian yoga or Oriental martial arts, meditation and breathwork practice is certainly key. With meditation, modern practices are starting to be much better than traditional ones, and both Joe Dispenza and Dawson Church have created excellent meditation techniques that seem to work much quicker than the traditional meditation practice. For most people, the sense of self or center of awareness is about the size of a tennis ball somewhere in their head. But in a small child, their sense of self fills their whole body. That's where we should all be. I always encourage people to do embodiment practices, and that is something that I teach. A lot of the peak states involve feelings and sensations, and if you're stuck in your head all the time and not really connected with your body, it's more difficult to be aware of any changes. Canadian shaman Alexandre Nadeau, who trained with the ISPS, suggests that it is actually difficult to fully heal if you don't have this kind of embodied connection with your body. Many people don't really consider this, but it's only since the 1960s that humans have stopped walking on the surface of the earth. That was when the rubber-soled and plastic-soled shoes first went into production. For millennia, people had worn shoes made of leather that allowed us to connect with the earth because it was alive material. So grounding is another important thing to do. Put your feet on the bare ground as much as possible. It gives you access to a lot of antioxidant activity, which is very healing for the body. Some scientists actually wonder if our lack of grounding is one of the reasons behind the epidemic of inflammation and chronic diseases that we're experiencing in the West. I've come across so many ways to access peak states, but here are 3 which seem to be well researched and work very quickly compared to traditional methods. Inner engineering is a practice that I do, which is taught by an Indian yogi called Sadhguru. Sadhguru is extremely well known in India and in the West, with a great YouTube channel with lots of content. He says, if you want to be happy, just do inner engineering. It's a 4-day training and a 21-minute daily practice. You may see the benefits in as little as 45 to 90 days, and the program is now taught online. The Finders is a really interesting book based on the 10 years research that Dr. Jeffrey Martin did on people with higher states of consciousness. He identified several states which he calls fundamental awareness. He's created a course based around the findings, and approximately 70% of participants shift into fundamental awareness in 1 to 14 weeks of training. It's another system that's taught online, and I think it's another really powerful thing to try for anyone serious about accessing higher states. If you're interested in seeing where you fall on the Finder's continuum of states, you can take their test here. It's at https://tinyurl.com/finders-test. Some of you may have heard of Buteyko breathwork as a treatment for asthma, but it's actually a lot more powerful and profound in its impact. Scientists have known for at least a century that as people get closer to death, they breathe more frequently and more deeply, while people who are higher functioning, martial artists and yogis, may only take 3 or 4 breaths a minute compared to the 15 to 20 which is normal in Westerners. When I read one of the many books about Buteyko, they talked about how when you get to a certain level of breathing, you will love exercise. I thought this was quite strange until I experienced it myself. I hate exercise. I would rather sit in a chair with a book and a bowl of ice cream than do anything energetic. But after doing the breathing practices for several weeks, I woke one day with a feeling of euphoria and a longing to exercise. It only happened that once, unfortunately, but it was a really powerful indicator of how good this technique is. So I'd always recommend that people investigate it. It's definitely worth a look. In conclusion, this is a very brief and personal look at ways to access peak experiences and peak states. It's by no means exhaustive. I haven't even mentioned dancing or chanting or psychedelics like LSD or sacred medicines like ayahuasca, peyote and magic mushrooms, or the many other ways that we clever humans have found to hack our brains over the last few millennia. One thing to bear in mind is if you have had a significant peak experience that was intense enough that you can still remember it and still call it to mind, the ISPS has a technique that may make it possible to convert the memory of that experience into a permanent state. That's one reason why pursuing peak experiences is worthwhile. And certainly they may be easier to find than permanent states.